Hey, it looks like we're live. I'm Mike Peterson, Senior Technical Marketing Engineer at Loft Labs, and I'd like to welcome my guest, Arnab Saha. Welcome, Arnab. We're going to be discussing your journey in creating multi-tenant Kubernetes platforms using Loft and vCluster. Would you like to introduce yourself and let
Yeah.
everybody know who you are?
Hey, thanks, Mike. Glad to be here and looking forward to the conversation today. So, quick intro about me. I've been leading infrastructure and deployment projects with Atlan since 2021. Specifically, we've been building this platform for internal development, self-serve, as well as for customers using virtual clusters, using Loft, Argo CD, and couple of other tooling to name a few, right? Prior to this, I've around over a decade worth of experience in different capacities in the engineering roles.
Well, awesome. All right, so let's go ahead and hop into some questions
All right.
about what your
Yeah.
original use case was and how you found us and how you found vCluster. So let's go and get started with. So
Yeah.
what was your original use case that you were looking at? You said you were building stuff out for customers. Like, what were you doing originally?
Yeah. Right. So originally, the way that we were shipping Atlin, when I joined in, we were in the version 1 of the product. So before I go in deeply about our journey, let me just give you a quick intro about Atlin itself. I think it might be interesting for folks to understand what we do.
Perfect.
In a very in a one line, right? Atlin is a home for data teams. So how GitHub is like a home for programmers, coders, right? Where all the code would be there in your GitHub. Atlan's page or the Atlan's idea is to be the home for data teams. So it has a host of features like data cataloging, column level lineage, metadata governance, right? Just to, in a nutshell, it helps our customers to bring in metadata of all their data sources, enrich that information, and also and these can be various connectors that Atlan brings in. So all personas of your data ecosystem within your company can leverage Atlan to make their day-to-day much easier. So yeah, that's a bit of a brief about what Atlan
Awesome.
does.
That's perfect.
Yeah, cool.
All right.
So yeah, go ahead, Mike. You had something.
Oh yeah, it's the same question. I would say. So what
Yeah,
was your original use case? How did you set this up? Like, what were you doing to
yeah,
give each customer their own, I guess,
right,
EKS cluster?
right.
Or-
Yeah, yeah. So our journey began with the version 1 of the product, where we didn't have a lot of customers in the first place. We were very early to pitch to customers. We didn't have a lot of certifications, and the journey that we took initially was how do we bypass this, right? Like of not having security certifications, but still be able to land a customer and ship Atlan in a way that they are comfortable with. So the idea was for us to uh, build like a since we were fully AWS, we used CloudFormation. We made sure like the entire infrastructure and Atlan as a product is packaged within this CloudFormation, and we used to give this to our customers so that they can choose to deploy it on their cloud accounts, uh, or if there are certain customers who are concerned about data being shared with other people in the same account, we would manage a sub account for them. So that was the early journey where we were able to uh, gather customers with the version 1 of our product.
How
uh,
how
yeah,
difficult was that to support? Right? 'Cause it sounds like you're almost talking about like a virtual
mm,
appliance or something like that. If they're installing it,
yeah,
was it super
yeah,
difficult to
yeah.
support that? Like,
Yes. The support actually, we had two ways to do it. One is we get kind of an access to their environment, but it's an isolated environment, depending on the kind of problems that environment would have. But just to answer, yes, it is a challenging environment to support, right? Because access becomes a huge challenge. So if there are certain critical customers who will not give us access, though there were certain customers who want an entire air gapped installation, so it should not even talk to the external world. So all we can do over there is it becomes like a back and forth, right? You give us certain logs, we look at it, we'll try to help you out. But people who wanted were open to giving us, say, kubectl access, right? We would be able to see the cluster, and also at the same time we had our observability stack. So we were able to proactively say, like, xyz is not working, these are the remediation steps, if, say, we didn't have the access to remediate that ourselves. So yeah, access management was a challenge in trying to solve customer issues at that time. Yeah.
So awesome. So hello, everybody. Everyone's saying hello. Glad to have everyone here. All right. So your
Everyone.
original use case, you're doing something. So you do that originally. So you'll either have like an EKS cluster or something like that per customer, or they're installing it air gaps
Right.
on their own stuff or something like that. So what
Yes.
what made you change from that to look at something like, vCluster or, different types of multi-tenancy or something like that? Like, was there something that happened where you're like, oh, let's see if we can do this all in our own Kubernetes cluster so we can manage it? How were customers that wanted air gap stuff? Did they actually start doing it there, or did they do it on their own?
Yeah. So this was a interesting journey. At that time, two things actually happened for us. One was a customer experience, right? What they had, and what basically they had a fleet of EKS clusters. And what we had to do is, for Atlan to get shipped, we will spin up another EKS cluster. So conversation started, why can't I use my existing EKS cluster, right? That's like a conversation that started from the customer's end, and we didn't have a very good answer to that, right? From a customer's perspective, if I have a fleet of clusters, why cannot I use that? That made us start think about, why can't we even leverage our existing infrastructure in a way that we can start reusing clusters, right? And we don't have this one-on-one dependency. And at the same time, the journey for us to we could see the journey that we can become SaaS, right? If we solve these problems of reusing, be it our infrastructure or the customer's infrastructure. So that is where multi-tenancy as a concept we started exploring quite a lot. So this was, say, like mid of 21, when these questions started arriving for us, right? And we experimented with application level multi-tenancy, where we are not really looking at infrastructure to provide us this virtualization, so to speak, but how can I reuse the application, or how can I make a multi-tenant application? So some of those early experiments did not go the way that we would want to do. One primary reason being, our customers are really they really want compute and storage isolation, which means like overall control plane isolation was very important for us, right? So with that in mind, and early kind of a failed experiment with application multi-tenancy, we bumped into virtual clusters. We started playing with virtual clusters, and we could see that this is something that can work. So yeah, that's how it overall
Awesome.
the journey
So like just
started.
namespaces by themselves wasn't enough, right? Like,
Right. Yeah.
so you were like, okay, let's do namespaces. Let's see if we can segment those on their own, like node or something like that. But then that was like, because you still needed the control
Yeah.
plane isolation.
Right.
Oh,
Perfect. Yeah. Glad you reminded me. So, like, after the application multi-tenancy that happened, we started experimented with namespace hierarchy as well, right? What Kubernetes offers natively. Uh, Although it can help us to achieve, uh, say, like, sandbox environment or an internal developer kind of environment, right? It also involved a lot of overhead for us to write network policies, RBAC, managing those namespaces ourselves, right? Uh, so that was not something that we had the bandwidth or the time to invest in to rewrite a lot of things ourselves.
so can
So
you?
which is why, yeah.
So we had a question
Sorry.
about like, what did you try in the first place? So application, yeah, there you go. So
Yes.
so when you say
Yes.
you're doing it at the application level, do you mean you're building like a SaaS or something like that, to where everyone would have access through it and then you would
Yeah.
manage?
Yeah. So think about, say, the database itself. Just like, let's take an example of Elasticsearch itself, right? I want to use Elasticsearch as a main cluster, but I want to share instances of Elasticsearch for each of my front-end application. But in a way, I'm kind of sharing Elasticsearch across all my customers. This kind of sharing of the database itself was not feasible for us. Like on an experimental level, we were able to achieve that, but to productionize this, it's not something that we were able to do, because it was critical for us to have that compute and the storage, right, to be absolutely separate. Just to add to that is like all the databases that Atlan has, right? These are all self-managed. Basically, these are all shipped on the cluster itself. These are not like managed specifically.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, and the customer's like, "Hey, is my data separate
Yeah,
from this other person's data?" And
yeah,
you'd have to be like,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah,
All
yeah,
right, so
yeah,
like
yeah.
vCluster enters in. So what did you
Right.
test with vCluster to begin with? Like, what kind of stuff did it solve in the beginning for you, and how did you build on it?
Yeah, yeah. So right off the bat, like just to create a virtual cluster, right? Over the CLI was fairly straightforward for us. We could straight up away see like it has its own API server, right? And which is kind of translating it onto my host. So we were able to run very quick experiments with not the full-fledged application, but a very uh, boiled down version of the application and spin it across, as in spin up multiple virtual clusters on the same host. And we were able to see, yeah, this is working, and there's isolation in terms of access also that is happening. But we were in a place that we wanted more kind of support as well for some of the like initial part of the POC that we were wanting to build, right? We wanted to build that entire self-serve platform, which means like while we have certain engineers working on some aspects of the entire platform, we also wanted some more expertise within the virtual cluster uh, community, which is where like we ended up looking at Loft. Uh, yeah,
That makes sense. So you tried out vCluster and did a POC, and like, well, maybe we could
yeah,
use a little bit of help or some support if we
yeah,
run into issues, and like, how do we do
exactly,
this exactly? How do we do
exactly.
this right? Okay, so you
Yeah,
said that like like self-service, right?
yeah,
So how are you doing
yeah,
self-service? Like, do your end users get access to Loft, or is your platform team accessing Loft? Like, what does it look like
yes,
when you're spinning up something
yes.
new for like a customer?
Right. So I'll tell you a journey for like say the platform team to start with, right? So the platform team typically gets a form, like it's a UI that they have access to, where they will fill in a couple of details like uh, what team are you about in, what will be your tenant name, which region do you want this to be spun up in, a couple of other things, and they submit it, right? And then like everything in the back behind the scenes starts to happen. So just as very high level components, right, I'll just give you a sense. We use Argo workflows, which picks up all this information via lambda functions basically. And then Argo workflows would invoke Terraform to provision the infrastructure, uh, which means like the host cluster. Say there's no host present at this time, it would spin up a host. Once the host is ready, Loft CLI would come into place to like create the virtual cluster for us. Then we use Argo CD to install the Atlan Helm application on it. So the entire application deployment starts happening via Argo CD. We do continuous delivery of our application updates via Argo CD. All infrastructure maintenance happens via Argo workflows, but internally Terraform is helping us do that. And Loft gives us the entire view of all our virtual cluster across all the different accounts, right? So just to give you a sense, we have a central control plane where all these components sit, and we have various other AWS accounts in different regions where all these hosts and all these virtual clusters will be deployed and managed via Loft.
Awesome. So Are you doing anything additional for like isolation, beyond just like a virtual cluster per customer type deal? Like, are there different levels
Yeah,
of requirements that
yeah,
customers have, right? Like, so some of them you may just kind of share, some of you may have to do like, oh, they need their own, like you said, their own
right,
storage and maybe
right,
like infrastructure.
right. So yeah, perfect. So what we do is on the Kubernetes side, right? Specifically EKS side, we for each virtual cluster we have a separate node group. So just from a AWS perspective, we leverage a lot of spot instances also. So for us, one customer is uh, two node groups. Like one is for us an on-demand node group where we would want to run some of like critical services which we don't want any disruption towards. And then there are certain stateless applications which can go on our spot. So we run two node groups uh, per virtual cluster. Uh, and that of course means the compute is isolated, the volumes will be isolated. Then of course like the security groups for these node groups and the host will be different. Like from the control plane security group you cannot access another virtual clusters in any way. Even through networking you will not be able to access it. So yeah, this is the way we kind of isolated each of our instances as well.
Are you using any of like the sleep features or anything like that to save costs?
Yeah. Yeah. So this was a interesting one, but just to give you a little bit of a backstory, right? With sleep, what happens is it relies on kind of your cluster autoscaler, so to speak, right? To from a from Loft's perspective, what it'll do is whatever sleep you define, it will scale down all your replica sets or deployments and so on and so forth, right? But your nodes actually will not scale down unless cluster autoscaler is actually doing anything, be it cluster autoscaler or be it Carpenter, right? What we had done originally is we configure cluster autoscaler on the virtual cluster level, right? But cluster autoscaler on the virtual cluster level cannot do anything on the node side. So it has to run on the host level, so that when Loft will sleep, cluster autoscaler will see there is no kind of workloads on my node, right? It will scale down. So even this, or say Carpenter, if you use in AWS, it needs to work on the host side. If it's on the virtual cluster side, the physical nodes will not scale down. So this is something that we still have to do.
Okay, awesome. So that sounds like something in the
Yeah,
future. Are there any
yeah,
other like features you're using? Are you using like with the new version of Loft, are you using like quotas and stuff like that to apply to customers? Have you started messing with like the quotas or any of the new features yet?
no,
Not yet. Okay.
no. So for us, we are still under the we are using still Loft 2.2 right now. Uh, Previously, with some conversations with Fabian and everything, right? There were a couple of things that we were really wanting to get with version 3, and I think they have been addressed. But there's a kind of a migration journey that we have to do because there are tons of breaking changes between the two.
Gotcha.
So that's something that we are in that's in our pipeline. I think by end of this quarter we should be up and running with. So couple of quick notes, right? The
Yeah.
things that I'm looking forward to with V3 is the Argo CD integration is pretty neat. That's pretty cool. I'm looking forward to that. Because we heavily use Argo CD, I want to see how that thing works in terms of managing the virtual cluster itself. There was this host path mapper kind of a configuration that came in. So in our observability stack, right, if you run an observability stack on the virtual cluster side, and by observability stack, let's talk about say Elasticsearch, Kibana, and FluentBit. So FluentBit, typically when you're running it on the host level, it passes the Kubernetes metadata onto your Elasticsearch so that you can visualize, okay, this was the pod or this was the node, XYZ Kubernetes metadata comes in. So up till 2.2, the metadata information didn't pass. But with V3, we have this configuration. We tried it out and it passes all the metadata. So that's another win because it helps us really deal with a lot of debugging flows easily, because it becomes a nightmare if you don't have certain of these metadata in your login pipeline. So yeah, that's another one that I'm looking forward to.
Are you sharing? I don't know what you can talk about. Are you sharing any like CRDs with the V clusters? Oh, we got some questions coming too. Are you sharing any other CRDs with the V cluster? Like, are you syncing anything else? Are you sharing ingress, or are you sharing anything like that to make configuration easier?
Yeah. So we use our own ingress controller overall, and originally we were using the Loft CLI only to install the virtual cluster instance, uh, and getting the pods to sync with our control plane. But as we scale, right, I think we started using our own virtual cluster templates, which lets us define the virtual cluster version or XYZ parameters that I need to send to, say, some of my developer instances. I want to run it with a different version of Loft V cluster. Say, uh, having like hundreds of customers, right? We might be on different Kubernetes version on the host side also, but I want to run certain newer Kubernetes version with the latest vCluster version. So that's where we like kind of use templates to not
Gotcha.
keep it universal, because if I use the CLI, I'll just get whatever the latest is.
So you're using some of the Loft features that are above like
Yeah,
the V cluster stuff, some of the enterprise things. So
yeah,
are you looking forward
yes,
to
yeah,
app versioning and stuff like that too with 3? So hopefully we get you on 3 here
yeah,
eventually with all the new features. Here
yes,
we
yes,
got a
yes,
question too. All right, so here we
yeah.
go. I can read it if you want. How exactly are you using Loft or virtual clusters on top of EKS? Correct me if I'm wrong, but you're also saying you're using EKS with autoscaler. How is Loft configured then? Are you using both virtual clusters, using Loft and EKS both? EKS.
Cool. So yeah, so EKS is our Kubernetes environment, right? And virtual cluster is something that your Loft is. Think of Loft as your gateway, API gateway, and lifecycle management. Virtual cluster is the underlying tool or service that helps you create virtual clusters. So for us, Loft is a server that sits on a control plane. Now, what I mean by control plane, let me actually pull up a diagram. It will help you to visualize well.
Well, that'd be awesome. And also, so you're just
Yeah,
like EKS is your underlying, like you said, Kubernetes cluster. You're breaking it up for
yeah,
multi-tenancy, and so with the image might show that you're
yeah,
using vCluster to break that up into multiple new control planes and different clusters you
yes,
can give to people. You
yes,
need a Kubernetes for vCluster to run on, right? Like, and then you can cut it up and give multiple people access over their own endpoints.
exactly. So yeah, I'll just give you a visual representation, right? So see, over here on the bottom is what my control plane would look like, right? So this is where Loft would sit, and Loft server is sitting over here, which has Loft server and agent component. And my destination is obviously another EKS cluster. It can be a GCP. Basically, it can be any Kubernetes server, right? Over there, all it needs to do is my Loft needs to be able to communicate to this environment, so that this cluster is configured within Loft. And from there onwards, on the default node of this Kubernetes cluster, there would be an agent sitting, which is the Loft agent, which is actually communicating between the Loft server. So from here, I'll be able to spin, like, say, give me like 3 Loft instances. So I will issue the command from my control plane, and I'll ask, this is my destination. I need to have, say, a number of virtual clusters. So in essence, both environments are powered by EKS. They can be any Kubernetes environment.
So I guess that's a
I
good
hope
thing
that
to bring up
answers
too.
the question.
Like Loft isn't SaaS, right? Like Loft you install in your cluster. So you need a cluster to install
Yeah,
Loft itself, right?
yeah,
Like, and then Loft you can bring other clusters into Loft that you can
exactly,
manage, right? Like, so like
exactly.
you've got your main EKS cluster running Loft. That's giving you
Yeah,
your UI and everything that you need to interact with. And then every
yeah,
other either
exactly.
customer or grouping of customers depending on their needs are deployed on another EKS cluster. And then like we can move into the next question. Like you're using node groups or something like that to like so do you have like one large EKS cluster and then multiple users on it, and you're doing like no groups, so you can do one-to-one virtual clusters to that, or how are you still deploying one EKS cluster per customer now that you're using Loft?
No. So we use one control. So one EKS cluster. For simplicity, let's call this the host cluster, right? Then from AWS or any cloud provider side, there will be certain limits that you might be able to hit. So original part of the discussion when I mentioned for us, we do 2 node groups per virtual cluster, right? So there is a hard limit on one host cluster or EKS cluster, the number of node groups that you can create. So that limit is 100 node groups you can create for per host cluster. So in a sense, we are able to create 50 virtual clusters on the same EKS host. As soon as our platform detects that there's no more space over here, it will spin up another EKS host for us.
And then you have it like per region and stuff too. But like the benefit of Loft is that you don't have to have, if you were doing it previously, you would have had 50 EKS clusters, 50 control planes running. So each customer gets their own, but this is now saying, they get their own in.
Yes.
All right, cool.
Yeah.
Hope that
So
answered
the same example, right? If I was supporting 50 customers earlier, I would have 50 EKS or 50 whatever, like Kubernetes clusters. In this case, I can have one Kubernetes cluster and I can support 50 customers on it.
Yeah, and in this use case, it's just EKS, but you could be doing this, anywhere you're running Kubernetes, right? So this is just talking about EKS because that's use case, but you could run it instead on-prem. Okay, so here's a question then. So what do you do? I don't know if you can talk about it. What do you do for your customers that need air gap? Like, do you use the same thing, or you try not to get those? It's super hard to support, right?
Yeah. So like, air gap customers are very difficult.
So what's your support model now, right? So now you're basically you're SaaS now. You're kind of giving them, a software service. Now you actually have control. Like, you have control over all this. You're able to troubleshoot it. Your support team can get on and access and fix things a lot faster.
Yes.
I don't know. You speak about the journey on that. Like, it's easier for your team.
Yeah, absolutely. Like right from the point to getting an instance, be it for your development work or giving an instance for our sales teams or our customers at the end of the day, right? The overall journey is it's very streamlined now. And the journey that we are headed towards is the footprint of a developer or a sandbox environment, right? The explanation that I gave you of how we set up that node group and everything, it's kind of the full-fledged high availability version of Atlan. We are working on a next version where if for a developer, say if someone is working on the front end side, they really don't need all those heavy backend stuff, right? We would want to be able to spin up an instance with one node itself, right? And then go ahead, support multi-cloud like with Azure and Google Cloud as well, so that we open it up for much more customers who have cloud provider requirements as well. Like some people will not move out of a particular cloud provider, right? So that's generally the idea.
Like templates and stuff are helping with that too, right? Like, oh yeah, that's a cool thing too, is if you needed to move somewhere besides like EKS, you could do that still with your same configuration. You would just change your provisioner, right? Like, so are you using CAPI or anything like that with EKS, or?
No, so we are using like the default provisioner that we get, right? To provision the EKS cluster, like I mentioned, like Terraform is currently being used.
Gotcha.
But yeah, there's a couple of other things that we are experimenting with. We'll see how those things goes.
Maybe we'll talk about those in the future. We'll see how that happens or how that works out, and we can have you on again. All right. So we got another question. Do you have a ballpark estimate of what you saved compared to individual clusters per customer? Like, do you have like a cost savings analysis or anything like that, or just like a ballpark?
Yeah. So just to give you a sense, to run an entire one customer, one EKS cluster where only one customer is running, for the kind of workload that we had, we used to range around $1,200 to $1,500 per month on AWS. With our current model, for one customer, we range around 500 to 800, depending on how much of workload they ramp up on that particular instance.
And does it depend too on like spot instances and usage too? So like you could get potentially more
Yeah,
savings with your automated, scaling down
yeah,
of vCluster and the nodes.
yes. Yeah, so this actually question is very related to how you manage your cloud resources, right? At the
Yeah.
end of the day, Loft in a way is not like it. It is a component within your infrastructure. Now, how do you kind of configure your nodes, right? So if uh, say I'm using spot instances, but I'm using spot instances on a region where the spot discount isn't that great, right? So and if I have a workload which will spin like 10, 15 spot instances, which are maybe like 5 to 10% lower than my on demand, it's like a trade off where I have instability, but I'm also paying kind of higher. So it's always like this kind of a question, or it's an ongoing configuration that you have to do with your auto scaling, with your instance types, between spot, between reserved instances, saving plans. These are like a ongoing effort that you have to do.
Each customer is different, so you end up with like a
Yeah,
separate thing.
yeah,
All right, so you have
yeah,
another question.
yeah,
How much time does it take to spin up a new environment now, and how much time have you saved compared to an earlier approach? So I guess comparing how long does it take me to get a new
yeah, yeah,
EKS,
yeah,
versus a virtual cluster?
yeah. So originally, when we were doing this entire setup, right, with CloudFormation, we uh, like 45 minutes to 50 minutes to get the entire thing up. Right now, say if I already have a host running, uh, it takes us around 15 to 20 minutes to get an instance up. If I don't have a host up, it'll take me a 30 minutes. But now these minutes are just not the infrastructure minutes. It's also the application warm up, application bootstrap, and things like that. Yeah, and these are some of the things that we're working towards, where we'll have certain instances in kind of a warm state, right? And we'll just turn them on. It's something that we are kind of working on, so we can drop this down to under 5 minutes.
That'd be awesome. So new customer comes on, and by the time they've
Yeah,
actually like
yeah,
signed up for everything, they're already
yeah,
running.
yeah,
That's probably a
yeah,
good feeling.
yeah,
All right, so how do you
yeah.
tackle like region restrictions? Is that part of the filling out like the wizard form in the beginning? Like you say, okay, we can deploy these in these regions. Um, do you have region
No,
requirements for certain customers?
yeah. So region limitation is just as much as where EKS or where my cloud provider is there, right? Whichever region they support, I technically can support deploying a virtual cluster over there. Uh, Obviously, there's like a bit of configuration that we have to do on the platform side to configure that region. Uh, but to just answer in very short, yes, there can be customers who want XYZ region which we don't have currently configured with the platform. In that case, we configure that platform quickly to be able to support that. Depends on the pipe, like the journey the customer is in when they will get onboarded and everything. But the only restriction is like if I use AWS, wherever EKS is supported, that's my restriction. If it's not supported in some region, I won't be able to support it.
And so as long as you can spin up EKS, you can
Yeah,
spin up Loft on
yeah,
top of it, and then you can control
yes,
and
yes,
manage and
yeah,
deploy V clusters.
yeah,
All right,
yeah,
so
yeah.
if everyone has more questions too, feel free to post them. We're kind of getting closer to the end of my questions. So like, I guess what we go on to next is like,
Mm.
what features would you like to see, from vCluster itself? And then maybe we'll talk about like Loft. Are there any features you'd like to see that you haven't seen yet? Or are there features that maybe you're using that the community is not using as heavily, and you're like, hey, maybe I can add on to this?
Yeah, so I think some of the things that I was looking forward to is part of the Loft V3, which I have not been able to fully leverage. But these are some of my top demands also, right? When I spoke to Fabian and everyone in the last chat, which was about the observability stack that I mentioned about. The Argo CD integration is something that is pretty cool. I think something that will be cool is with crossplane, if there's a if there's a Loft provider or if there's a virtual cluster provider, there's a way for us to do it, but that might be something cool to see.
Awesome. Yeah. So add on to Rich too. Yeah. We're talking about, so like if you're talking, so this, how long does it take to spin it up? If you're talking about just a virtual cluster, you're talking about like seconds, right? Like compared to like however long your Kubernetes provider takes to spin up something, right? Because you're not spinning up a new cluster. You're just basically deploying into some pods in a namespace, or pod in a namespace, right? Like in your control plane comes up initially, like immediately. All right, cool.
Yeah. I think some good to haves. I think overall, there are certain situations where, say, your virtual cluster's agent is not communicating with your Loft server, right? And the error messages that your Loft server will show is not actually what the issue is. So that time you have to kind of really dig through the logs and things at your host. So somewhere to make debugging a bit more intuitive. That might be.
Gotcha. So better debugging. That's next. I don't know if Fabian's probably listening. So better debugging would be awesome, so that you don't have to leave. Like you're saying, do you do a lot of like troubleshooting in the Loft UI? Like or are you going? So that's
So a lot of times Loft UI will give me enough information if it's a simple one. But say connectivity is a general one when it's not able to communicate or it's in some sort of an error state or pending state. Typically, you'll have to go into your host and see what's happening with those virtual cluster pod logs over there.
Is it nice kind of having, so just a random question, is it nice kind of having control over the control planes, whereas EKS, it just kind of like deploys it for you? You might not necessarily be able to manage the control plane. Like, is it better for you, for end customers, to be able to control the control plane and configure things how you want it there, compared to like, because EKS, right, like you're not necessarily SSHing like the controllers or anything like that, right? Like,
yeah. So if you're talking about the host cluster where we ship the virtual cluster, I think at the end of the day, to answer you, customers should be not getting into the nitty-gritties, as far as I think, right? They need to be abstracted away from all of the heavy lifting that happens behind the scenes. But folks who actually are building the platform, they need to have tools or observability or visibility into building this in a more resilient way. So my ask is probably on the, or my thought is probably on the folks who build the platform should have more visibility or more tooling to configure things. But the end journey for the customer should be as smooth as possible without even realizing what's happening behind, right? They don't really care whether it is Loft, whether it is EKS or whoever it is, right?
So do you have any interesting stories or anything like that about like when you finally got this POC running? Were there any like, oh wow, like, or any like moments of excitement like in the team or?
Yeah. So I think we got our proof of concept kind of tested internally, and we started to roll it out for our internal development teams by March of 2022. March, April, kind of, right? Which is where before really going to customers, we opened it up for all our developers to start spinning up instances with this, right? And there was a moment of awe, right, when things were just coming up. Like they fill in a form, and they got an email, and they are just able to log into the instance. So that was a great journey, like the messages and everything that came about from different people. But of course, it was a very early stage, so it had its own stability or scalability challenges as well. So yeah, it was a great journey, and towards the end of it, we were able to make sure it's production ready.
Are you still using virtual clusters for development? Like, are developing your next gen?
So we use Loft right now on both, like for our development use cases as well.
Okay, cool. So you're kind of using the same thing that you're using to deploy everything else, and you're testing it there. All right, awesome. Like, do your developers ever log into Loft at all? Never, right? Just your platform engineers. Like you said, you've got wizards for everything.
Yes. So for developers, pretty much their interaction with Loft will be for access management, meaning they have a customer, something has happened, they need to get access, or they're working on a feature, they need to access that instance. They will log into Loft via SSO, and they will get the context of that virtual cluster, and they'll start using your Kubernetes commands as you would. So that's the kind of interaction a non-platform engineer would have with Loft. But just to, in sense, all developers interact with Loft. Some do it with the UI, majority do it with the CLI.
Awesome. I don't know if we've got anyone have any other questions or anything like that. I might start moving to if you've got any closing thoughts or recommendations or anything like that. What would you here you go. What would you say to someone who's just looking into multi-tenancy? Like, should they skip and just start trying to do a POC with like vCluster? Like, what kind of insights can you give with your journey of like what would you do if you had to start all over again, like day one?
Yes. So I think it all depends on what is your business use case, right? What do you need out of multi-tenancy? So with everything in the technology landscape, terms or something seems very fancy to start using it. But I would just generally say, just ask yourself what's your business use cases. If it is developer productivity, self-serve, you might the journey or the way that we architected Loft or the clusters, right? It might not be required for you. A simple like virtual cluster, or if you would want to do namespace based experiment with that, even that works fine. So in like, just to simplify it, it depends on what your use case is. But having said that, virtual cluster is a great gateway for you, which will kind of remove all the overhead for you to manage all these. Say with namespace, you'll have to write a lot of things yourselves. That is something that will be way more easier for you.
Awesome. That makes sense. So do you have any closing thoughts or recommendation or anything like that? Do you want to talk about like what's next? What's next on the horizon? Like what are you looking forward to with your platform? Like what's coming out? What's the big feature you're adding?
Yeah, so for us, the bigger, like two big things is overall opening up multi-cloud support and reducing some of our internal development footprint, like I was mentioning, and leveraging some of the additional features that Loft is giving us, right, with sleep and everything, making sure we start approaching some of the other cloud provider support in a way uh, that we leverage sleep and auto scaling features from day one. Uh, so yeah, I think overall, just from a numbers perspective, uh, right now we support more than 200, close to 300 virtual clusters on our production platform uh, in different flavors, right? These can be actually licensed or signed customers. There could be certain proof of concept ones, but overall, just from a number perspective, 2 to 300. And by this year, we want to be geared to support 1,000. So the platform needs to scale along with Loft and all our tooling. Um, so yeah, that's scale is what we are scale, and overall open the top of the funnel is what we are gearing towards.
So I thought of one more question. How hard was it to sell the idea of let's just not do on-prem and let's build, software as a service instead?
Yeah,
Like, was it hard to sell that? Was it, hey, we're going to build this new thing, but it's only really going to support
yeah,
SaaS? Like, how hard was that to sell the
yeah.
management?
No, I think the management themselves or the leadership within Atlan is more geared towards that the industry trend, right? Because typically everything that was on-prem was also moving towards cloud. And specifically in the multi-tenancy journey, I think we were very early to be able to adopt that. And I think that has made a lot of these conversations with our customers are also interesting. Just not from a product standpoint, when we talk about our infrastructure, uh, many people get excited about how we are kind of shipping things. So of course there are customers who will support or who will want kind of on-premise options, but it totally depends. At least our uh, main thing is SaaS. If there's something that really needs to happen, we just take it on case by case basis. But SaaS is what we are um, doing. And just to give you a sense, like we had something that we used to ship our version 1 of the product, right? Another release management tool, we've migrated everything to SaaS and Loft overall right now.
So as the business world works, we're not going to do something until we need to do it. If someone asks
Yeah.
for it, you're like, yeah, I guess we could do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, cool. I guess, are there any other questions from our attendees or anything like that? I think we're kind of wrapping up. Unless you have anything else you want to add, I might go ahead and get to our outro, because I think most of the stuff that you talked about was super interesting. I really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your journey with us. Like, got to hear a bunch of stuff I hadn't heard yet. I heard a little bit before, but some of the stuff that was new was awesome to hear. You want to say if you want to say bye, or
thanks for having me, Mike. It was a great chat. I enjoyed myself. Looking forward to speaking with you soon.
Oh, I can't wait to have you on again, and maybe we can go over some of the new stuff you're doing, like how your migration went. Like, how did you migrate from 2.0 to, or 2.2 to 3? And what that looks like now, how it changes your setup. Maybe we'll have some slides for that. We can slide it up for people so they can have like a normal one. All right, so say thanks everyone for joining. Thanks. If you have any questions or want to try out Loft or vCluster, join our Slack at slack.loft.sh, and then there's a QR code there you can scan to get more information. Follow us on LinkedIn. Follow us on Twitter. Go to our YouTube channel and check out everything. We got some videos on how to set stuff up. We'll have more demo videos and stuff like that. Yeah, definitely, Pascal. Thanks again, Arnab, for coming on and really sharing your journey and letting us know like how you're using stuff and letting us know how to use it in production even better. All right.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you so much. I think we're gonna head out, and we'll see everyone next time.